In the year 479 before the Common Era, by all reasonable calculations and expectations, the Persian invasion of Greece should have been finished, should have been completely concluded and over with, the fate of the Greek world seemingly sealed. The great and once magnificent city of Athens, the jewel of Greek civilization and culture, lay utterly and completely in ruins and ashes, reduced to nothing more than broken stones, shattered columns, toppled statues, and charred timber scattered across the landscape. The sacred temples on the Acropolis had been burned and desecrated, the homes of citizens destroyed, and the walls that had protected the city for generations torn down stone by stone. An absolutely massive Persian military force, one of the largest armies ever assembled in the ancient world, still maintained iron control over the very heart of the Greek mainland, occupying key cities and controlling vital routes. The commander of this formidable and overwhelming force, a capable, experienced, and deeply ambitious man named Mardonius, who had proven himself in numerous campaigns across the vast Persian Empire, possessed everything conceivable working in his favor, every advantage a general could hope for. He commanded vastly superior numbers of troops, drawn from across the empire, elite infantry forces of the highest caliber, who had been trained in the rigorous Persian military tradition and tested in battle, and arguably the finest and most feared cavalry forces anywhere in the entire ancient world. Horsemen whose reputation alone could break enemy morale, all strategically deployed on open terrain that had been carefully chosen and selected, specifically for achieving total and complete victory. His position seemed unassailable, his victory inevitable. Standing in direct opposition to him was an extremely fragile Greek alliance that was led primarily by the legendary warrior state of Sparta, known throughout the Mediterranean for its military prowess and the almost inhuman discipline of its warriors who trained for war from childhood. The Greeks had absolutely no cavalry forces to speak of whatsoever, perhaps only a few hundred horsemen compared to the thousands the Persians could field. They were outnumbered significantly and dangerously by a professional army, and they had virtually no room whatsoever for making any mistakes or errors in judgment on the battlefield, where one wrong decision could mean total annihilation. For nearly 2 full weeks, an eternity for armies in the field, these two enormous armies faced one another in the region near the small town of Plataea, completely locked in what seemed like an endless silent standoff that tested the nerves and endurance of every soldier, from the highest general to the lowest foot soldier. Both armies could see each other clearly across the landscape, watching, waiting, calculating. There were no grand heroic charges to speak of like those celebrated in epic poetry. No quick decisive battles that would settle everything in a single afternoon of glory and bloodshed. Nothing at all but relentless pressure that built day by day, gnawing hunger that wore down the soldiers day by day as supplies dwindled, and persistent thirst that plagued both camps and sapped their strength under the Mediterranean sun. The tension was almost unbearable, the waiting agonizing. What ultimately followed and transpired wasn't decided purely by raw strength alone or by the size of the armies involved, though both were formidable, but rather by patience and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment, careful and deliberate use of terrain and geography to maximize advantages, and one absolutely fatal miscalculation on the part of the Persians that would cost them everything they had worked for. What ultimately followed and transpired wasn't decided purely by raw strength alone or by the size of the armies involved, but rather by patience, careful and deliberate use of terrain and geography, and one absolutely fatal miscalculation on the part of the Persians that would cost them everything. When the Persian forces finally decided to attack and press what they believed was their advantage, believing they had found their golden opportunity at last, they charged directly and headlong into the one specific military formation that had been specifically designed and perfected over generations of warfare to utterly destroy them. The legendary and feared Spartan phalanx, the most formidable infantry formation the world had ever seen. A full year earlier, back in 480, before the Common Era, a year that would live in memory forever, the Persian monarch Xerxes, the king of kings who ruled the largest empire the world had ever known, stretching from Egypt to India, had personally led and commanded a truly colossal invasion force into Greece, an army so vast and numerous that ancient sources claimed it drank entire rivers dry as it passed and took 7 days and nights just to cross the Hellespont on the bridge of boats. The legendary stand of the 300 Spartans and their allies at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae became an instant legend that would echo through the ages and inspire warriors for millennia to come, celebrated in song and story. But in pure military terms, it was ultimately a defeat, a heroic delaying action that bought precious time for Greece to prepare, but could not stop the seemingly unstoppable Persian advance southward. The great city of Athens itself, the cultural jewel of Greece and center of learning, was subsequently captured by Persian forces and systematically burned to the ground in an act of deliberate destruction, its temples desecrated and destroyed, its walls torn down stone by stone, its population fled. The seemingly unstoppable Persian war machine, drawing on the vast resources of an empire that spanned 3 continents, appeared completely invincible and unstoppable, a force of nature that would sweep all resistance before it, like leaves before a storm, making Greek independence seem like nothing more than a futile dream. Then came what many considered the miracle that occurred at Salamis, one of history's most dramatic naval engagements, where the combined Greek naval forces, led by the brilliant and cunning Athenian commander Themistocles, who had the vision to see what needed to be done and the political skill to convince the other Greeks to follow his plan, used the extremely tight and narrow confines of the straits to their tactical advantage, denying the Persians room to maneuver their superior numbers, completely smashing and destroying the much larger Persian fleet in a stunning naval victory that changed everything and shifted the momentum of the entire war in a single day. This crucial naval victory represented a major turning point in the entire war and proved that the Persians could be beaten. But it certainly wasn't the final end of the conflict or the Persian threat to Greek independence, as a massive Persian army still occupied much of Greece. Xerxes, growing increasingly worried and concerned about his extremely long and vulnerable supply lines, stretching back thousands of miles across hostile territory to Persia, and about potential threats to his throne back in his distant homeland, where rivals and ambitious nobles might take advantage of his long absence to plot against him, made the difficult and controversial decision to retreat back to Asia with much of his fleet destroyed, taking with him a substantial and sizable chunk of his massive army, perhaps as much as half his forces, or more, according to some estimates. But he absolutely didn't give up on his grand ambitions or abandon his long-planned campaign to conquer and subjugate all of Greece and add it to his empire. He deliberately left behind his most trusted general and his own brother-in-law, a highly skilled and deeply ambitious man named Mardonius, who had urged the invasion from the very beginning and believed passionately that Greece could and should be conquered and brought into the Persian fold. And he left this experienced and capable commander with the absolute best of the best forces available from across the empire, an absolutely enormous professional army consisting of elite Persian immortals, the legendary 10,000 warriors who formed the elite core of Persian military might and who earned their distinctive name because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000, with replacements immediately filling any losses. Medes from the Iranian plateau who were renowned as skilled and fierce fighters, Scythians from the distant steppes who were masters of mounted warfare and the bow, and even many thousands of pro-Persian Greeks from various city-states who had sided with the invaders, either believing Persian victory was inevitable and wanting to be on the winning side, or hoping to gain political and economic advantage through collaboration with the new order. While the ancient historical sources, particularly the detailed writings of Herodotus, who is rightly considered the father of history, and who wrote his account only a generation after these events, while many veterans still lived, tend to give much higher numbers for both armies that are probably significantly exaggerated for dramatic effect, and to make the eventual Greek victory seem even more impressive and miraculous, modern scholarly estimates based on careful analysis of logistics, food supply requirements, water availability, and the carrying capacity of the land often place Mardonius's military force at somewhere around 100,000 men, which was still a staggering and incomprehensible number for that time period in history when most armies numbered only in the thousands or tens of thousands at most. This wasn't some skeleton crew or token garrison force left behind, merely to occupy conquered territory and keep the peace. This was a carefully hand-picked army consisting of the finest troops available with a single clear mission that had been given to them by the King of Kings himself: finish the job that Xerxes had started and bring all of Greece under Persian control once and for all. Mardonius was so supremely confident in his position and overwhelming power that after the Spartans hesitated and delayed marching north to confront him, showing their characteristic caution and careful deliberation, he actually reoccupied the ruins of Athens, walking through the burned-out shell of the once great city, and proceeded to finish destroying whatever remained of the city just to prove a point and demonstrate his complete and total dominance over Greece. The absolute crown jewel and most valuable asset of his impressive army was undoubtedly its cavalry forces, which represented the cutting edge of military technology in the ancient world and had won countless battles across Asia. The Persian horsemen, which consisted of a deadly and highly effective mix of skilled horse archers who could shoot accurately at full gallop, while controlling their mounts with their knees, raining arrows down on enemy formations from safe distances before wheeling away, and heavily armed lancers equipped with long spears who could smash into infantry formations with devastating force and momentum, were literally the stuff of nightmares For Greek commanders who had to face them in battle and knew they had no effective counter to these mobile warriors, Mardonius was an intelligent and cunning commander, with many years of hard-won experience in numerous campaigns across the vast Persian Empire. And he chose his battlefield ground very carefully and deliberately, effectively drawing the Greek forces through a combination of threat and maneuver to the wide-open plains located near the town of Plataea. Absolutely perfect terrain for cavalry operations and maneuver warfare, where horsemen could operate at will. Here, in this open landscape with few obstacles, rough terrain, or natural barriers, his swift horsemen could easily flank enemy formations from any direction, wheel around to attack from unexpected angles, constantly harass infantry positions from safe distances with arrows and javelins without ever having to close to contact, and essentially dictate and control the entire flow and pace of the battle according to his wishes and strategic plan, forcing the Greeks to react to his moves. The Greeks, by stark and unfortunate contrast, had almost no cavalry forces to speak of whatsoever, perhaps a few hundred horsemen at most. The Greek city-states, focused on their infantry traditions, had never developed strong cavalry traditions or invested in horse-breeding programs, and their wealth and military focus had always been on developing and perfecting heavy infantry fighting in close formation. For a traditional hoplite army that relied entirely on heavy infantry fighting, shoulder to shoulder in tight formations, this represented the absolute worst-case scenario imaginable, a nightmare situation that every Greek general feared. On paper, when you examined the situation logically and calculated the relative strengths of both armies, things looked extremely grim and nearly hopeless for the Greek alliance. Mardonius firmly believed that the Greeks were significantly outnumbered, completely outmaneuvered and outclassed, and that it was only a matter of limited time before he could successfully lure them into a carefully prepared trap and completely annihilate their forces in a single decisive engagement that would end the war. For the Greek soldiers, staring down from the hills at the sprawling and vast Persian military camp, spread out below them on the plains, watching the seemingly endless rows of tents and the cooking fires at night that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon in every direction, it must have felt like they were facing an absolutely unwinnable war against impossible odds, a fight they couldn't possibly win. Leading this fractious and often quarrelsome alliance of various Greek city-states and warriors, each city with their own interests, pride, and traditional rivalries, was the Spartan regent known as Pausanias. As a direct nephew of the legendary hero Leonidas, who had fallen defending the pass at Thermopylae against overwhelming odds, buying time for Greece with his blood and the blood of his 300, Pausanias carried the immense weight of Spartan honor and military tradition, as well as the ultimate fate of all of Greece squarely on his shoulders, a burden that would have crushed a lesser man. The common cliché and stereotype of a typical Spartan leader is that of a blunt, rather mindless warrior who knows only violence and direct assault, a simple and brutal man who solves every problem with a spear thrust. But Pausanias was far more complex and capable than that simplistic and misleading image would ever suggest to those who didn't know him. He was a genuinely cunning and remarkably patient strategist who thoroughly understood both the considerable strengths and the serious weaknesses of his army and its composition, knowing exactly what his forces could and couldn't do, on the battlefield and never asking the impossible. And the absolute core and foundation of his army, the element everything else was built around, was the famous hoplite phalanx formation, the tactical system that had made Greek infantry legendary throughout the Mediterranean world, and had won countless battles against numerically superior foes. To really and truly comprehend and understand the complex tactical puzzle that Pausanias faced as a commander sitting on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron and looking down at the Persian host, you absolutely have to understand the phalanx system itself in considerable detail and appreciate both its tremendous strengths and its critical vulnerabilities. It was much more than just a simple formation or arrangement of men standing in orderly lines. It was a complete system and tactical approach, developed over centuries of warfare and refined through countless battles, consisting of a tight and dense block of heavy infantry soldiers, usually arranged in approximately 8 ranks, deep for optimal balance between depth and frontage, though sometimes more for added weight and pushing power depending on the specific situation and the enemy faced. Each individual soldier or hoplite wore protective bronze armor, including a helmet that covered most of the head and face with only small openings for eyes and mouth, a breastplate or cuirass that protected the vital torso from strikes, and greaves to protect the vulnerable shins from low blows. But his most critically important pieces of gear and equipment were his large shield and his long spear, without which he could not function effectively in the formation or contribute to the collective strength. The spear, which the Greeks called a dory, was a massive weapon measuring 7 to 9 feet in overall length, with a sharp iron spearhead on one end for thrusting and killing, and a bronze spike on the other end for planting in the ground when resting or as a backup weapon if the spearhead broke. The shield, known as an aspis or hoplon, from which the word hoplite derives, was a 3-foot-wide dish-shaped defensive item constructed of wood, often poplar or willow, covered with a thin layer of bronze for protection, with a central grip and an arm strap that distributed the weight. It was specifically designed to cover and protect the soldier's left side and simultaneously the right side of the man standing next to him in formation, creating an ingenious system of mutual protection where each man's shield protected his neighbor. When these shields were locked together properly in battle formation, overlapping like scales on a fish, they created a virtually solid wall of overlapping shields that was extremely difficult to penetrate with weapons. The front ranks of soldiers leveled their long spears over the top of this shield wall, effectively creating a deadly hedge of sharp iron spear points, projecting forward toward the enemy like the quills of a porcupine. A phalanx formation on the move, advancing in perfect step with shields locked and spears bristling, was an absolutely terrifying and grinding wall of death that could crush most opposition through sheer weight, discipline, and coordinated pushing power. But here's the critical catch, and it's truly a significant one that cannot be understated or overlooked when understanding ancient Greek warfare. This tremendous frontal strength and forward-pushing power came at a very serious cost in terms of tactical flexibility and maneuverability on the battlefield. The phalanx was inherently slow and quite clumsy to maneuver as a unit, requiring relatively flat ground and constant cohesion to maintain its effectiveness. And it was horrifically and dangerously vulnerable on its exposed flanks, and especially its rear, which had no protection at all. The soldiers were packed together so tightly in formation, often shield to shield and shoulder to shoulder, with barely room to move, that they simply couldn't just quickly turn or wheel to face a sudden threat coming from the side or behind without breaking the entire formation. A well-trained squadron of fast-moving horse archers, the kind the Persians had in abundance, could easily ride along the flank of the formation and pour devastating volleys of arrows into the soldiers' unprotected and exposed sides, killing men who couldn't effectively defend themselves or even see the arrows coming. A determined cavalry charge directed into the rear of the formation would cause instant chaos and panic, rapidly breaking the cohesive formation and turning the previously efficient killing machine into a panicked and disorganized mob that could be slaughtered piecemeal with ease. This was the exact and specific problem that Pausanias faced as the Greek commander, sitting on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, looking down at the vast Persian army. He knew perfectly well and understood from experience, training, and study of previous battles that if he allowed Mardonius to fight the kind of battle that the Persian commander wanted, a battle of sweeping maneuvers and rapid movements on the open plain where cavalry could operate freely and use their superior mobility, his vulnerable phalanx formations would be quickly encircled, surrounded from multiple directions, and systematically destroyed by the superior and more numerous Persian cavalry before they could even close with the enemy infantry. His entire strategic approach and battle plan depended completely on finding an effective way to negate and neutralize Persia's single greatest advantage and asset, their overwhelming cavalry superiority. He absolutely had to find some method to force the fast-moving Persian cavalry forces to fight on his own terms and on ground of his choosing, where the phalanx could use its considerable strengths without being exposed to its dangerous weaknesses. The battle didn't suddenly kick off with some kind of heroic charge or dramatic opening move that would be celebrated in epic song and poetry. Instead, the engagement began with an extremely tense standoff and stalemate that dragged on continuously for 11 long and exhausting days that must have felt like an eternity to the soldiers on both sides. This wasn't a conventional fight conducted with swords and spears clashing in a single afternoon of glory, but rather a complex battle of nerves, careful positioning, and strategic patience that tested the resolve, discipline, and endurance of both commanders and their armies. Pausanias made the first truly masterful and brilliant move that would define the entire engagement and set the terms for everything that followed. He absolutely and stubbornly refused to be lured down onto the open plain where Mardonius had established his main camp and base of operations, no matter what provocations the Persians offered or how much they tried to goad the Greeks into attacking. That flat terrain was the perfect killing ground for the Persian cavalry to operate effectively and destroy the Greek phalanxes with their superior mobility and devastating flanking attacks. Instead of taking that obvious bait and playing into Persian hands, he carefully positioned his massive Greek army, which modern scholars and historians suggest was probably around 80,000 men strong, including both heavy infantry hoplites and lighter armed troops and support personnel, on the high ground along the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, a position that dominated the entire region and offered numerous advantages. This elevated position, gave him several key and crucial advantages that would prove absolutely decisive in the days to come. First, and most obviously, the hilly and broken terrain, full of rocks, gullies, and rough ground, was absolutely terrible for effective cavalry operations, severely disrupting any large-scale charge or sweeping maneuver that the Persians might attempt, and negating their primary advantage. Second, attacking uphill is physically exhausting and extremely difficult for any military force, requiring soldiers to fight, while climbing and losing the precious momentum that was so crucial to success in ancient warfare. Mardonius was far too intelligent and experienced a commander, having fought in numerous campaigns across the Persian Empire, to order his infantry forces to charge directly up at a heavily armed Greek phalanx that was holding a fortified uphill position where the Greeks could simply push downhill with gravity on their side and the advantage of elevation. So the two enormous armies simply watched each other warily and waited, each commander hoping the other would make a fatal mistake or be forced to attack under unfavorable conditions. The long days were filled with constant tension and anxiety, broken only occasionally by minor skirmishes and probing attacks that tested the resolve of both sides without committing to a full engagement. Mardonius repeatedly sent his cavalry forces, his most valuable and effective troops, on daring hit-and-run raids specifically designed to test and probe the Greek defensive lines, and hopefully provoke them into abandoning their strong position and coming down to fight. In one particularly famous clash that became well known throughout Greece and was recounted in detail by Herodotus, the Persian cavalry general named Mecistius, one of the most respected and feared commanders in the entire Persian army, led a strong and aggressive attack directly on the Megarian troops, who were positioned in a somewhat exposed section of the Greek line. The Megarians, getting absolutely hammered and taking heavy casualties from the Persian cavalry assault and the relentless arrow fire, urgently called for immediate help and reinforcement before their entire section of the line collapsed completely and created a gap the Persians could exploit. Pausanias responded quickly and decisively by sending in a group of elite Athenian hoplites, along with their supporting archers, to assist the beleaguered and hard-pressed Megarians before they broke. In the fierce fight that followed and developed, with both sides committed to the struggle, Mecistius, wearing his distinctive and valuable golden scale armor that marked his rank, was knocked from his magnificent horse after the animal was wounded by an arrow, and was subsequently killed by the Greek soldiers, who quickly surrounded him and struck him down before he could recover. It was a huge and significant morale boost for the Greek forces, who had feared the Persian cavalry, and they paraded the body of the fallen Persian commander along their lines to prove that even the Persian elite could be defeated and killed. But even with this notable success and the tremendous boost it gave to Greek morale throughout the camp, Pausanias still wouldn't take the bait or be lured into a premature attack down onto the plain where the full Persian army waited. He steadfastly held his advantageous ground, refusing to give Mardonius the battle he desperately wanted. Mardonius maintained his position as well, equally patient and willing to wait, knowing time was a weapon too. The Greeks clearly had the better defensive spot and position on the high ground, virtually unassailable by direct attack, but the Persians controlled the plain below and the nearby city of Thebes, which provided them with steady supplies, support, and a friendly base. Mardonius calculated and figured that time was fundamentally on his side in this strategic standoff. He thought he could simply wait patiently, continue to harass the Greek positions with cavalry raids that wore down their supplies and morale, and eventually their fragile alliance of independent city-states or their vulnerable supply lines would break and collapse under the mounting strain. The great strategic chess match between two skilled and experienced commanders had truly begun in earnest, and both were willing to wait days or even weeks for the perfect opportunity to strike the decisive blow. The popular and common image that most people have of a Greek army is just a solid and uniform block of hoplites in their distinctive bronze armor, standing shoulder to shoulder. But that mental picture is incomplete and somewhat misleading, and at Plataea that particular assumption would have gotten every single one of them killed in short order by the Persian cavalry and massed archers before they ever closed with the enemy. Pausanias was a smart and sophisticated general, and he understood the critical need for combined arms operations that integrated different types of troops with different capabilities and roles. A huge and significant part of his army wasn't hoplites at all, but rather lighter troops with completely different equipment and fighting styles. While there's considerable and ongoing debate among modern scholars about the exact numbers and ratios, some historians estimate that a large portion of the Greek force, perhaps as much as half, actually consisted of lighter armed troops known as psiloi, who fought in a completely different manner than the heavy infantry. These were skirmishers and light infantry armed with javelins that could be thrown from a distance to harass the enemy, slings that could hurl lead bullets or stones with surprising accuracy and force, and bows that could shoot arrows at individual targets or in massed volleys. Men who simply couldn't afford the expensive hoplite gear and equipment that could cost as much as a small farm or several years' wages for a common laborer. The Athenians in particular brought a crucial contingent of skilled archers who were experienced in using the powerful composite bow and had practiced their craft for years. These light troops were Pausanias's primary answer to the Persian missile threat that could devastate a phalanx from range before it ever made contact. The Persian army was built around and centered on the archer as its primary offensive weapon, unlike the Greek focus on close combat and the decisive push of shields, and Persian tactical doctrine had been refined over centuries of warfare across their vast empire. Their standard approach, refined over centuries of warfare across Asia, often involved planting large wicker shields firmly in the ground, forming a protective wall for their massed archers to shoot from behind in relative safety, protected from return fire. The goal was to completely shred and devastate an enemy formation with thousands of arrows, creating a literal storm of shafts before the infantry even made physical contact, breaking their morale and formation and turning them into easy targets. Pausanias knew and understood from experience and reports of previous battles that his hoplites could absorb and take some arrow fire, thanks to their heavy bronze armor and large shields, but definitely not forever. And eventually casualties would mount. Shields would be riddled with arrows, making them heavy and unwieldy, and the formation would weaken and potentially break. The light infantry forces acted as a vital screen and buffer between the vulnerable phalanxes and the Persian missile troops, who wanted to get into effective range. They could move out in front of the phalanx formations with their greater mobility and lack of heavy armor, harass the Persian archers and cavalry units with their own missiles, and keep them from getting into the perfect range to effectively attack the main hoplite battle line with concentrated volleys that could cause real damage. This crucial tactical layer is often overlooked and underappreciated in popular accounts of Greek warfare, which focus on the drama of phalanx combat, but was absolutely essential during the long stalemate period at Plataea where the two armies faced each other. While the hoplites stood firm and ready in their tight formations on the hills, maintaining their discipline and cohesion day after day in the hot sun, it was these light troops who were engaged in nearly constant skirmishes along the Asopus River that separated the two armies, trading missiles and occasionally engaging in hand-to-hand combat. They proved their worth and value in the fight that killed Mecistius, with Athenian archers helping drive back the elite Persian cavalry with well-aimed volleys. By integrating these different troop types into a cohesive battle plan that used each to its strengths, Pausanias demonstrated and showed a sophisticated understanding of warfare that went far beyond simple frontal assault or relying solely on the phalanx. He knew that to make his phalanx work effectively in battle against the Persians, he first had to protect it and screen it from the various threats that could destroy it before it ever engaged the enemy. After more than a full week of frustrating stalemate, with neither side able to force a decisive engagement, Mardonius grew increasingly impatient and frustrated with the situation unfolding before him. The waiting game he had initiated wasn't working as he had planned and confidently expected based on his experience. The Greek army wasn't collapsing or fragmenting as he had confidently anticipated they would under the pressure of his constant harassment and the difficulty of maintaining such a large force. If anything, the Greek position appeared to be getting bigger and even stronger as more allied contingents arrived from various city-states across Greece, answering the desperate call to defend their homeland against the Persian threat. He needed to somehow force their hand and make their current defensive position completely impossible to maintain, compelling them to either attack or withdraw. So, showing his tactical adaptability, he deliberately shifted his strategy from positional warfare to a war of pure attrition, targeting the Greeks' ability to sustain themselves in the field. He once again turned to his greatest military asset, his superior and highly mobile cavalry forces, but this time, showing his tactical intelligence and understanding of logistics, he didn't waste them on risky frontal attacks against prepared positions that could result in heavy casualties for minimal gain. Instead, he sent them on a sweeping raid around the entire Greek army, taking advantage of their mobility, and up into the mountain passes behind the Greek position that served as the Greeks' main supply line and only route back to the Peloponnese. The raid was a devastating and complete success that changed the entire dynamic of the standoff in a single bold stroke. The Persian horsemen, riding hard and fast through difficult terrain, intercepted and destroyed a huge supply convoy that was bringing desperately needed food and other critical provisions to the Greek army. Suddenly, the secure Greek position on the hills became more like a trap than a protective fortress. An army simply can't fight effectively on an empty stomach, and hunger quickly breaks down morale, discipline, and the will to fight. But Mardonius wasn't done or finished with his aggressive attrition campaign. 2 days later, showing his relentless pressure and refusal to give the Greeks any respite, he launched an even more daring and bold raid that targeted something even more critical than food supplies. This time, the target wasn't food supplies or equipment, but something even more essential to basic human survival: water itself. The entire Greek army, all 80,000 men and thousands of animals, depended completely on a single source of fresh water known as the Gargaffian Spring, located behind their defensive lines near the base of the mountain. In a brilliant and audacious maneuver that required both considerable courage and tactical skill to pull off successfully, Persian cavalry forces managed to get behind the Greek army through difficult and broken terrain, fought their way through defensive positions to the spring location, and cut off all access to it, denying the Greeks this vital resource. Whether they fouled and contaminated the water source by throwing dead animals into it, or simply used archers positioned nearby to make it unreachable and deadly to approach, shooting anyone who tried to fill water skins, the result was effectively the same and equally disastrous for the Greeks, who now had no water. The Greeks' only reliable source of fresh water was suddenly gone, denied to them. This was effectively a checkmate move in the strategic game, a masterstroke. Mardonius had executed a textbook strategic maneuver, using his mobility advantage to strike at his enemy's weakest and most vulnerable point, rather than attacking their strength. The high ground that had protected the Greeks from cavalry attack now isolated them from both water and supplies, turning advantage into liability. The position that gave them a tactical advantage in any potential battle now threatened to starve and dehydrate them into submission, without the Persians ever having to attack the strong defensive position directly and risk heavy casualties. Thirst and steadily dwindling supplies were crushing morale throughout the Greek ranks, and the various contingents from different city-states began to argue heatedly about what to do, with some wanting to retreat immediately, while others urged standing firm. Pausanias couldn't stay in position much longer without water. Men were already suffering, and soon they would be unable to fight effectively. But he also couldn't attack down onto the plain without being cut to pieces by cavalry during the approach. Mardonius had outmaneuvered him brilliantly, forcing his hand and compelling him to make a move. The long stalemate that had stretched for nearly 2 weeks was about to break dramatically, and both commanders knew the decisive moment was finally approaching. Facing a complete supply catastrophe that would force his army to either move or die of thirst in a matter of days, Pausanias had absolutely no choice but to order a tactical withdrawal to a new position where water was available. The plan he devised and communicated to his subordinate commanders was strategically sound in theory and should have worked. Under the cover of darkness, when the Persian cavalry couldn't effectively pursue and harass them during the vulnerable movement, the entire army would fall back in organized fashion to a new defensive position located in front of the town of Plataea itself. This new location, known among the Greeks as the island, because it was situated between 2 streams that provided ample fresh water, was better protected by the nearby town's walls and fortifications, and most importantly, had reliable and abundant access to freshwater sources that couldn't be easily cut off. A nighttime retreat was the only way to accomplish this difficult and dangerous movement, Without being cut to pieces by the Persian cavalry during the vulnerable withdrawal, when the phalanx formations would be broken up and moving, but ordering a complex night maneuver involving coordinated movement with tens of thousands of soldiers from a dozen bickering city-states, each proud and independent and jealous of their status, is one thing. Successfully executing it in complete darkness with minimal communication is quite another matter entirely, especially with an army that had never trained together as a unified force. And on this particular night, everything that could possibly go wrong did go wrong in spectacular and disastrous fashion. It started with a stubborn Spartan officer named Amompharitus, a man of fierce pride and rigid principles, even by the demanding standards of Sparta, who flatly and categorically refused to move his unit when given the order to withdraw. He saw any withdrawal, even a purely tactical one designed to preserve the army, as a flight from the enemy and cowardice, a permanent stain on Spartan honor and tradition that could never be washed away and would shame his men forever. Pausanias, caught in an impossible position, spent a huge chunk of the precious night arguing intensely with his insubordinate officer, trying desperately to convince him that this was sound tactics and not cowardice, throwing the entire carefully planned schedule into chaos and dangerous delay. Meanwhile, the Greek center, made up of Corinthians and other allied contingents who didn't have the same legendary discipline as the Spartans and were more concerned with their own safety, began their withdrawal as originally ordered, but got confused and disoriented in the complete darkness with no clear landmarks. Instead of moving to the new designated position as carefully planned, they fell back all the way to Plataea itself and the safety of its walls, much farther than originally intended, seeking shelter. They were now completely out of the fight that was coming and wouldn't be able to provide any support to the other contingents. As dawn broke over the landscape, painting the sky with red and gold light, the situation was absolutely terrifying. For anyone who could see the whole tactical picture, Pausanias, having finally convinced the stubborn Amompharitus to move by threatening to leave him and his men behind to die alone, began pulling his Spartans and their loyal Tegean allies off the ridge position they had held continuously for days. The Athenians on the far left flank of what had been the Greek line saw them moving in the growing light and started their own withdrawal, not wanting to be left isolated and surrounded. The cohesion and unity of the Greek army was completely gone, shattered by the chaos of the night and poor communication. Instead of a strong new consolidated battle line in a prepared position as planned, the Greek forces were scattered and separated across the landscape with huge gaps between them. You had the Spartans and Tegeans on the right, roughly 9,000 hoplites plus their supporting light troops, the Athenians on the far left with about 8,000 hoplites and their light infantry, and a massive gaping hole where the center was supposed to be, the place where all the other Greek contingents totaling tens of thousands of men should have been providing crucial support and holding the line together. It looked less like a planned tactical retreat to a prepared new position, and exactly like what Mardonius had been patiently waiting and hoping for during all these long days, a panicked, disorganized rout of a broken and defeated army fleeing in disorder. From his camp on the plain below, Mardonius watched the sun slowly rise on a scene that must have seemed like a gift from the gods to him, vindication of his patient strategy. He saw that the Greek center, thousands upon thousands of men, had completely vanished from the field, nowhere to be seen. He saw the Spartan and Athenian flanks widely separated by a huge distance and moving away from each other in different directions, completely exposed to attack from all sides. After 11 long days of patient strategy, careful maneuvering, and waiting for exactly this opportunity, he believed his moment had finally arrived at last. The Greeks were broken and fleeing. He made a critical and ultimately fatal assumption based on what he could observe from his position, one that seemed completely reasonable given what he was seeing. He saw the disorganized movement, the scattered formations, the apparent panic and confusion, and thought it was a full-blown cowardly retreat by a defeated enemy who had finally broken under the pressure he had applied. He believed the Greek alliance had finally shattered under the immense strain of his patient siege warfare, just as he had predicted. In his mind, already tasting the sweet victory he had worked so hard to achieve, the battle was already won and decided. All that was left was the pursuit and slaughter of the fleeing Greeks, turning this into a complete triumph that would cement his legacy. Throwing aside all his earlier caution and patient strategy that had served him so well, Mardonius gave the immediate order for a general assault by all available forces. He wouldn't wait to properly organize his forces into optimal formation or for his archers and cavalry to be in their most effective positions for a coordinated attack. He ordered his elite infantry, the best and most experienced troops in his entire army, to cross the Asopus River immediately and charge headlong after the supposedly fleeing Spartans before they could escape and regroup. In his eager desire to deliver the final crushing blow and complete his mission for Xerxes, he personally led the charge at the head of his best troops, his elite bodyguard of 1,000 Persian nobles mounted on the finest horses. It was a moment of supreme confidence bordering on dangerous arrogance, a calculated gamble to turn what appeared to be a Greek retreat into a complete annihilation of their army that would end the war. But in his haste and eagerness to seize what looked like certain victory, Mardonius had made a terrible and ultimately fatal mistake that would cost him everything. The Spartans weren't actually fleeing in panic as he believed, and he was now leading his more lightly armed infantry into an uphill close-quarters fight against the best trained, most disciplined, and most experienced heavy infantrymen in the entire world, who lived for exactly this kind of combat. He had played the strategic game absolutely perfectly for nearly 2 weeks, showing remarkable patience and skill in using his cavalry to force the Greeks from their position. But now, at the final critical moment when victory seemed within his grasp, he was about to play right into his enemies' hands and give them exactly the kind of fight they were specifically designed and trained from childhood to win. The grinding close-quarters phalanx battle where Persian mobility meant nothing. Thousands upon thousands of elite Persian infantry, confident and eager for battle, splashed across the shallow waters of the Asopus River and charged up the slopes toward where the Spartans and Tegeans were positioned. Confident of complete and total victory, and eager to destroy the legendary Spartans whose reputation had spread throughout the known world, a massive volley of arrows, thousands of shafts darkening the sky like a cloud, filled the air, meant to sow chaos and cause heavy casualties among the Greeks before the hand-to-hand fighting even began. but the Spartans weren't routing or fleeing in panic as Mardonius had firmly believed when he gave the order to attack. On Pausanias's sharp and clear command that rang out across the hillside, they halted their movement immediately, turned as one to face the approaching enemy with perfect discipline, and began forming their phalanx with the precision and speed that came from endless training since childhood in the Agage. The Tegeans, their loyal and trusted allies who had fought beside Sparta in many battles, formed up beside them without hesitation, shields locked together creating an unbroken wall, long spears leveled forward at the perfect angle. In mere moments that seemed almost miraculous to those watching, they had transformed from a withdrawing column into an immovable wall of bronze and iron that bristled with spear points. According to the detailed account of the historian Herodotus, who interviewed veterans and collected eyewitness testimony, Pausanias paused for a tense moment that must have felt like an eternity to make a final sacrifice to the gods and read the omens, following sacred Spartan tradition before any major battle, as the Tegeans, unable to wait any longer and eager to come to grips with the enemy, charged forward toward the approaching Persians. When the omens were finally favorable and the gods had given their blessing through the proper signs, Pausanias gave the order, and the entire Spartan phalanx, 9,000 strong and representing the finest heavy infantry force in Greece, charged down the slope to meet the Persians in the close combat that would decide everything. What followed was the decisive clash of the entire war, the moment that would determine the fate of Greece and whether it would remain free or fall under Persian domination. The Persians, many wearing quilted linen armor that was flexible and light and carrying wicker shields that were maneuverable but offered limited protection against heavy blows, were individually brave and skilled warriors who had proven themselves in many campaigns. But they were built for mobility, speed, and missile fire, not the grinding, brutal push of sustained close combat against heavily armored opponents. The Spartans were a machine built specifically and exclusively for this exact kind of brutal close-quarters fighting, trained from age 7 in nothing else. When the lines smashed together with tremendous and shocking force, the sound audible across the battlefield, the superiority of the Greek heavy infantry was immediate, overwhelming, and brutal beyond description. The hoplites' long spears, measuring 7 to 9 feet in length, significantly outreached the shorter Persian weapons like swords and short spears by several feet, allowing them to strike from relative safety. Their heavy bronze shields and plate armor deflected arrows, sword blows, and even direct spear strikes that would have killed less protected warriors. The sheer weight and disciplined, perfectly coordinated pushing of the phalanx, with each rank adding its force to those in front, began to drive the Persians steadily back down the hill through pure physical force and momentum. The fighting was utterly savage, merciless, and brutal beyond imagination. According to Herodotus's vivid account based on survivor testimony, the Persians fought with incredible courage and desperate determination, showing no cowardice whatsoever, desperately grabbing at the long Spartan spears with their bare hands, trying to break them or pull them aside to get past the deadly points. They dropped their bows, which were useless at such close range in the press of bodies, and drew daggers and short swords, trying desperately and frantically to get past the deadly wall of spear points that kept them at bay and killed anyone who came too close. Individual Persian warriors showed remarkable and inspiring bravery, fighting to the death, but it wasn't nearly enough against the superior system and equipment. The critical turning point came when Mardonius himself, fighting on horseback among his elite bodyguard of Persian nobles who formed a protective ring around him, was spotted by the Greeks who recognized his distinctive armor and position. He was struck down and killed by a well-aimed blow, with Herodotus specifically crediting a Spartan warrior named Amnestus for delivering the fatal strike that ended the Persian commander's life. The death of their commanding general and the man who had led them for years was the final straw that broke Persian morale and will to fight. The Persian command structure, which was centered entirely on Mardonius's personal authority and charisma, collapsed instantly and completely with his death. Their attack, which had been driven and sustained by his personal will, presence, and leadership, dissolved into panic and chaos as word spread through the ranks. The Persian line shattered and broke apart completely, and what had been an organized attack became a complete rout with men fleeing for their lives. Meanwhile, on the other side of the scattered battlefield, the Athenians had engaged and decisively defeated their pro-Persian Theban opponents in a separate but equally important action that prevented them from coming to aid the Persians. The Greek victory was complete, total, and decisive beyond anyone's expectations. The Persian rout turned into a terrible and merciless slaughter as panic spread through their army. Thousands of Persian soldiers, throwing down their weapons and shields to run faster, fled desperately back to their fortified camp, seeking safety behind the wooden walls. But it proved to be no sanctuary at all, merely a trap. The victorious Greeks, their blood up and seeking revenge for years of Persian aggression, the burning of Athens, and countless raids pursued them relentlessly without mercy, stormed the wooden walls of the camp in a fierce assault, and cut down the now leaderless and trapped Persian soldiers by the thousands in brutal close quarters, fighting inside the camp that showed no quarter. Plataea proved that wars aren't won by legends alone, but by the ruthless resolve to finish what others only began,